Hi, this is Zach with Worn&Wound. Today I'll be taking a look at the Nomos Glashütte Metro. This is a watch that they released at Basel World 2014 that was met with a lot of excitement. Nomos doesn't come out with brand new lines of watches that often. Most recently, before this, was a line of kind of luxury watches in the 20K range. But in their kind of normal range, say up to 6K, they've been kind of the same watches with some minimal variation on dial and size and etc. for quite some time. And this is the first really new design from them, and it's a really profoundly different design from really anything else that's out there. It's very quirky. It's very interesting. I think it's kind of a divisive design in that it has elements that people will love and elements that people might not like. But no matter what, it's a very unique design. It's very Nomos, and that it's kind of playful, yet it's a beautiful, accessible luxury watch. And it also made waves because this was the first watch of theirs to feature the Nomos swing system. The swing system is their escapement. So when you look in here, you have this whole area here. Now typically, and previously to this watch, they were making these, purchasing these essentially from Switzerland, most likely from the Swatch Group from ETA, using those standard parts. These are very complicated parts to make. They cost a huge amount of investment to make yourself. And most brands that manufacture movements like Nomos don't do it themselves because it's just such a massive undertaking. So for Nomos to do this and to have complete independence from purchasing from Swiss brands is a really big step forward for the brand, and really kind of amazing because of the fact that these are still relatively affordable watches. That said, the Metro comes in at $3,780, so it is an expensive watch by our typical standard, but it's quite a bit less than I think what a watch like this would typically be, say closer to 10 or even more for other in-house movements. And then it's just this very cool watch, and one thing that Nomos did that I think many more watch brands really should do is they went to an outside industrial designer to design the watch. So they contracted Mark Braun. He's a Berlin-based designer who has worked on many projects in furniture and accessories and lighting. He has a very contemporary and modern, kind of interesting aesthetic to him that isn't really rooted as much in kind of the kind of classical German, kind of strict, look that you might associate with some of Nomos' other designs. Not to say that they're ever really that harsh, but you have, the Tangenti and the Tango mats with that classic Bauhaus look, the Orion, which is super precise, the Zurich, which is, a little bit more classical looking. And then this watch has this kind of different, quirky direction to it. Yet it is still, this $3,000 watch. So, it's a very interesting mix of things. It has this very cool movement in it, the DUW 4401, which is the first movement using the swing system. Features a power reserve located below 12 sub-seconds, a date, and it's manually wound. So yeah, there's a lot to go over here, so let's get into it. The case of the Nomos Metro is a new design for the brand. It's a 37 millimeter cylinder here with wire lugs, which you can see, which makes it kind of an interesting watch to wear. I mean, 37 millimeters is a nice, smallish medium size, definitely small for, contemporary style, but I think watches are obviously trending back towards this. But with the wire lugs, it wears nice and small, I'd say, but in a good way because it's also all dial, so it doesn't look or feel too small. It's wonderfully thin at 7.9 millimeters here. Their movements are quite thin, especially their manually wound movements. So they're able to do these really slim, lithe cases. And what they did here with the case back and the crystal is create these very smooth domed structures. So the case back just very, very slowly, kind of gradually raises up to a display here, through which you can see their beautiful movement, which we'll talk about later. And then the crystal has a very similar shape to it, so it kind of gently domes up and then kind of flattens out over the top, and that is, of course, a sapphire crystal. One kind of odd thing about the crystal, though, I did notice that you might be able to see under with the camera, I'm not 100% sure, is that it almost casts a bit of a shadow onto the dial because of how that bends there. So I don't know if it's refracting or what, where there's perhaps a little bit of a buildup of sapphire at that crest, but you can see something's a line on the dial. At first it was distracting to me, but now I kind of don't see it unless I kind of make my eyes see it. Wire lugs here. These are not full wires as you'd expect. You can see here the straps do have a quick change system, so it is a typical spring bar, and they put the quick change in here just to make that all the more easier for people. So, don't worry, these are not sewn around. I do like wire lugs. It's something we've seen a handful of times in the last few years. They're interesting because you kind of get the feel of this kind of lugless watch, but then it'll wear a little bit, I think a little bit better, a little bit larger than a true lugless watch would, but it keeps the focus really nice and centered on the dial. And though I'd consider this a thoroughly contemporary watch, there's a little bit of the kind of, hint back to the vintage welded on wire lugs, which these would have come from originally. The crown here is like about 5.5 millimeter wide crown. It's very thin. It's a nice little crown. It's going to be hard to see, but there's like tiny little balls studding it all the way around, giving it almost a knurled look. But when you look at it very closely, you can see they're little spheres. And so it grips very nicely when you want to turn it to wind the movement. It's polished all the way around, so it's not like there's like complicated finishing to talk about, but it's just one of those cases where everything feels and looks super precise. I mean, as you can see, it's a totally seamless installation here of this case back. In fact, it must be pry off. I didn't even think about that before, but because there's no marks in here as to how you turn it or screws or anything, so you just get this really clean, seamless look, which is very impressive. The Nomos Metro it's definitely a very quirky watch, and that's something that I both, I like about it, but it took me a little bit of time to get used to it. Especially, I personally own one of the Nomos clubs, and that has like a very kind of clean, precise, symmetrical look to it. We've reviewed the Orion before, which is just like every little moment on that watch is so perfectly proportioned and symmetrical that when you take a look at this at first, it's almost a little jarring. And I think this kind of speaks to the designer Mark Braun's aesthetic, and I think where Nomos is trying to push to be this very unique, modern brand that isn't necessarily selling just to, people who are looking for that, classical heritage kind of brand thing. I'm thinking Breguet hands, et cetera, et cetera. They're looking for a new aesthetic. They're trying to kind of plan where they're going. They're a very modern brand. They're definitely a brand that's going to be around for a long time. So this kind of new DNA is interesting, and it's one of, in my opinion, slight discord. You have kind of interesting and slightly awkward elements that work together to make something that's kind of playful and kind of fun in a way that if you ever look at Nomos's marketing materials, their encyclopedia, just browse their website, there is an underlying sense of humor to everything that I'd say no other watch brands have. I mean, every other watch brand, especially German ones, take themselves so seriously that the brevity and the kind of levity, rather, that Nomos has is really awesome, frankly, and very different. And so now looking at this dial, you have a surface that is galvanized with white silver. So it's a pale metallic surface. Sometimes it looks white, sometimes it looks a little bit gray. In this light, it looks more of almost a darker gray. And then on that dial, you have a couple of indices. So around the periphery, you have a minute index, which consists of numerals and small dots. And this to me is immediately where things get a little kind of curious. So the numerals are almost like large compared to the small dots, which are then pushed further out to the edge. So there's almost like a funny rhythm to it. And it's not to say there's anything off about it. It's just like it's a kind of a quirky. It's not, say 50%. The dots are not 50% the size of the numbers or anything like that. It's a slightly different relationship. And then when you step in, you have this interesting gap that, in my eyes is almost, it's a funny gap. It's like, there's tension to it. Are these dots a little bit too far away? Or are they a little bit too close to those numbers? I don't know. Are they just right? It's, there's this play going on that makes this watch so much more dynamic than I think I even gave it credit for when I first looked at it. This index here, presumably an hour index, though it's non-numerical. It's dots, black dots, and kind of a seafoam green dot for 12, 3, and 9. Obviously, there's this big date window here at 6. Now, the color seafoam green here is another kind of strange choice. Whenever there's a use of color, it's kind of an interesting decision for somebody to make, because obviously that'll affect, people will like a color, dislike a color. It affects kind of what goes with it. Here, it's this very sparing usage of this color, but it's a funny, almost vintage-feeling minty seafoam green that is kind of similar tonally to the silver. So when I look at this at a glance, I see the black more than I see that green, and then only after kind of stopping for a second do I start to see that green again. As such, even though those dots are larger, I kind of see almost gaps next to 60, 15, and 45 until I take a longer look. And it's just an interesting effect. It kind of plays with your eyes a bit. Then moving in above 6, you have this subdial, small seconds. Most, if not all, of the Nomos watches have small seconds. Personally, one of my favorite features on any watch, just like small seconds. And on this one, you have a depressed dial with circular graining here, which is a kind of a classical touch. Simple marks for every 5-second intervals there. You're not really using that to count seconds anyway. And then the second hand is bright lacquered red. So there you have another shock of color, which brings a lot of attention to that area, though it's not necessarily an area where function matters so much, which is interesting. But perhaps the coolest feature on the watch is actually the power reserve here, positioned between 12 and 1. Now, the odd positioning of that is just how it is on all of the Nomos' power reserve movements. Though this is a new movement number because it has a swing system in it, they did have very basically an identical movement before. And for their power reserve, they do this very interesting power reserve. Rather than a sweeping hand, you have this porthole kind of window there, which has a layer of green, and then through that is a little meter. And what happens is when you wind it, you'll notice that the white and the red ratio changes. So the more you wind it, the less red there is, saying that the power reserve is full. And that whole thing spins around and turns, so it's never in one spot. So it's immediately like a dynamic and changing area of a dial. So it's a very funky and bizarre kind of version of a power reserve that, I love it. I think it's extremely cool. But it's also off-center, so it immediately throws, your sense of symmetry for the dial. It puts a lot of weight in that weird spot. And then to kind of counter that, but to almost make things a little bit stranger, the Nomos Glashütte logo is positioned on the left side, but a slightly above kind of the center line. So, the baseline of Glashütte there, I think, might even be a hair above a line if you were to draw it from 9 to 3. So it's a little bit floating, and you just have this strange kind of arrangement in play there that, it kind of like, as my eyes as a designer, it kind of sometimes want things to align to a perfect grid, and this doesn't necessarily do it, but you get something with personality instead. So, it's just it's very curious. I imagine there was a lot of positioning, just moving little things around endlessly till they found this one kind of clicked in feeling for it. Now just quickly looking at the date at 6. Nomos has these great large dates. They have an interesting date mechanism I'll talk about in a minute. You have these just super large dates here, very clear. It's a trapezoidal window, so it kind of fits with the feeling of, a circular dial. Just very cool. Lastly, you have the hands. These are interesting hands. I've never seen hands quite like them before. So they're stick hands that go from a thin stick to an extremely thin stick towards the end. So you get a bit of like a pointer feeling to it. They're easy to read, they're clear, they're interesting looking. So yeah, just a nice, an interesting way, once again, to finish off the dial. Inside of the Metro is Nomos' new DUW 4401 movement. If you're familiar with their movements, they've actually changed their naming convention to this DUW plus a serial number from what used to just be Greek letters. So previously, in the most simple movement was their alpha, their manual wound plus a date was the beta, and they had a bunch of different ones as they changed their automatics, their world timers, etc. But now, as they're adding the swing system, they're changing to this DUW plus serial number. And DUW stands for Deutsche Uhrenwerk, and then the serial number will just be different as per the functionality of that movement. So the first two were actually in the Lambda and Lux, though those actually didn't have the swing system in it, to my knowledge. But this one does, the 4401. And if you've seen the alpha and the beta, it's still clearly the same architecture as those movements. It's a beautiful, simple manual wound movement, 23 joules in there, 42-hour power reserve. It has Côte de Genève or Glashütte striping, whichever you prefer to say. It has star bursting on the wheels here, perlage underneath the balance. The swing system itself doesn't look any different than it did, than the escapement did before. You just, know in your mind that it was in fact made by them. So, it's more of a conceptual step forward than it is a visual step forward. But, as far as movements go, it's really how it is made and how it works that matters. And I mean, the escapement, don't underestimate, that really is such a complicated thing to make. The balance spring in particular, I think, are notoriously difficult and expensive to make. I think they put something like 50 million euros or some outrageous number out there into the research and development of this swing system. So, it's a really massive step forward for this brand. I mean, it should not be overlooked at all, and as they slowly convert all of their movements to having the swing system, I think the value of these watches is just going to continue going up. And frankly, I mean, the prices seem to be going up a little bit too, but they're still in this kind of interesting, accessible luxury place. But for their manufacturer movements, I mean, there really isn't anything else out there. But so now, the 4401, as I mentioned before, it's, manual wound, stop seconds, sub-seconds at 6, peripheral date, and then their patented power reserve. I showed you the power reserve before. It's such a cool mechanism, how it works when you wind it, that the whole thing spins around and the red kind of slowly goes away, then comes back. I love having a power reserve available. I mean, pick the watch up in the morning, you see where it is, see if you need to wind it, how much you need to wind it. It's such a easy way to keep your watch in good maintenance. And this watch, and frankly all of Nomos's date watches, I think in particular ones you're going to want to keep wound, because their date mechanism is, it's curious. So it's a peripheral date mechanism, which means that rather than being on top of the movement, they actually have a date wheel that's going around the outside of it. This is something they've also patented. And it has a quick set function, but it's not quick set the way, an ETA movement is. So to change the date here, you will wind between 9 and 12, and then you'll go back. So that's the same way, vintage watches did. And it's definitely an old-fashioned way. Now, it's quicker, obviously, than going around full 24 hours. But, if you have to go through a whole date, as I will after this, to get it back to the 4th, it'll take some time. So it's kind of annoying. It's a bit inconvenient. So it is a drawback of the design. But like I said, if you're wearing this daily, if you're keeping it wound up, it's, not really going to be an issue for you. But once again, just to underline, the thing that's exceptional is that they're making this in-house, and now they have that swing system. I mean, few brands can make that claim. So, on the wrist, the Nomos Metro wears beautifully. I think the 37 millimeter case size here is just perfect. I love how it fits on my wrist, just the proportion of it to my wrist. I have a 7-inch wrist here. I think it wears actually a bit larger than 37, like if you'd said this was 40 or something, I might have believed it, but it does measure out to 37. And that's largely because it's all dial, so it it just kind of looks a bit larger. But then the wire lugs make it sit very comfortably. Obviously, they pull down the sides a bit, so you don't have this issue with like something that's with lugless cases. The strap fits in there and you get a little bit of kind of a bump off of the case. Here it flows very nicely around your wrist, so it just fits very perfectly. And I don't know if people often comment when I say Instagram my club, which is a 36 millimeter case with very long lugs, that the lugs look so long. When I'm wearing it, I don't feel that, but here, you don't have that issue at all. They totally kind of, perfected these proportions. And then the look of this watch, it's so interesting. Like I said, when I first saw it, I was like, wow, that's very different, but I don't know if I loved it. And having worn it now for, about 2 weeks, I do love it. I mean, it's just a watch I could wear all the time. I think it's so interesting looking. It's very contemporary. It doesn't feel like any other watch, but it does have some kind of hint, kind of mid-century, almost American design, even with the seafoam green. But the look is very interesting. It's sophisticated, but it's playful. It's definitely totally, appropriate watch for any circumstance other than the most formal, I'd say. Obviously, it's not a sport watch either, so, you don't want to do anything rough with it. But it's a great watch to wear to the office. It's a great watch to wear out, restaurants, etc. I mean, this is, perfect for that. It's just a cool day-to-day watch. And they obviously have this inspiration for it. The Metro name, speaks to this kind of like metropolitan concept. I don't know if I necessarily was called it's like this urban or watch to it, but it definitely has a feeling of something more structural, more architectural to it. So yeah, I mean, it looks great. I have it here with a light blue shirt. I like how that picks up both the seafoam green, but then also emphasizes the red there. And now, as with all Nomos watches, they come on shell cordovan straps. This is Horween shell cordovan. Their straps are great. They're also, the replacement straps are about $90, so they're very affordable. This one is actually quite long. They have them in different sizes, so I'm wearing this one on the smallest hole, which I don't typically do, and it is a bit loose. But yeah, I think you would typically, this might be their long strap, and typically medium would be a little bit, fit a little bit differently. Yeah, it's perfect. I think you can put a different color strap on here if you'd like. Though there is something kind of correct about the black, and it's, kind of a little bit starker, which I think works with the concept. To wrap up, the Nomos Metro is really just a fantastic watch. I mean, it's one of the most interesting watches, I think, to have come out last year. And, as a harbinger of their kind of new swing system, I think it was a very cool way to get it out there, because it's not just invisible. They didn't just say, oh, look, guys, all of our old watches now have this in it. They're like, here's this new watch. It's really different. It's quirky. It's by this up-and-coming designer, Mark Braun. And, obviously this watch now has gone on to win many awards. I didn't mention that before, but it's just getting a lot of, notoriety behind it. And by the way, it also has this swing system in it. And it's still, a $3,780 watch, which, like I said, it's in this price that's interesting. If this was not their in-house movement, it would just be too expensive. But it is their in-house movement. It is a manufacturer movement. It is all made in Glashütte. So it's really a really good price for what it is. And while that might be totally, unobtainable to many, I mean, this is, something I would certainly have to save for, sell other watches for, It's nice to have these kind of grail pieces out there that are still within reach. It's not a $20,000 watch. It's not a $100,000 watch. It's just under $4,000. So it is inconceivable, boundaries of what can be purchased. And it's really like no other watch. So wearing it is super enjoyable. It's such an interesting style. This can really, if you have the kind of personality for something a little bit quirkier but still very refined, I don't know if there's much out there that's better than this. That said, within Nomos' online, there's a lot of competition. I'm still craving that Orion 38 datum watch, which came in at $3,000. I don't know if the price will go up once they change the movement to one of their DUW movements, though. Anyway, so please read the full review on Worn&Wound. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you.